Welcome back, everybody, and welcome to stage one of these parallel sessions we are offering. Now, as I mentioned before, we went into our break. We will be having 4 parallel stages and therefore sessions from now till 4:30. So pick one of those. Preferably this one where you'll find sessions that will meet your needs and interest the most. Because as you can see, if you look into our program, we tried to build in several issues into our sessions that have been the center of all the debates surrounding data protection, data security, and the data economy as a whole, basically. But for everybody who decided to join me for now at our main stage today, welcome back, and I'm very happy to guide you through the program of our stage here. And I'm also happy that I'll be joined by Malte Beyer-Katzenberger in just a second. He's a policy officer at the European Commission, and he'll be talking a bit more about a few issues that have already been touched upon this morning by Andreas Hartl from the Federal Ministry of Economic Affairs and Energy, because Malte will be talking a bit more about the Data Governance Act, the Data Act, their implications for the data economy, and also the developments for data intermediaries. And I do not know whether you had time to listen into the session with Andreas this morning, but there were a few questions regarding the developments surrounding the Data Act and the Data Governance Act, and especially questions surrounding how a data intermediary might work in practice. So I guess it's perfect that you'll be giving the presentation now. I think we'll be having time for a few questions afterwards, but I'll be giving the floor to you for now.
Well, thank you, Rebecca. Thank you for have chosen this stage. I'm really pleased to be participant to this meeting. I should say it's still a bit strange to come again to an online meeting, but events in my house actually remind me that not my house in time as my household, but in the apartment block I'm living in, remind me that COVID is not over, and it's still good to be prudent. So also happy to be online today with you today. Indeed, I'm happy I can build on what Andreas Hartl has already said this morning. He's been obviously a colleague on all our files on the Data Act. But before maybe zooming in to specific provisions, let me just guide everyone who has been not following the recent work of the EU on data so closely to get you to where we then go on the intermediaries. So there's 2 pieces of legislation that will probably come, but let me share first my screen up and then pull the slide so that you can see it as well as I can see them. Just go for the slideshow. That should be right, no? Rebecca?
Not yet now. Yeah, perfect.
It's coming. Okay, I mean, first I would invite you also maybe to type in a search engine of your choice, Data Access Map and ODI as an Open Data Institute, and you will come to a page that has a really clickable version of what you see here on screen. This is the Data Access Map, and I think in a very nicely arranged way, it shows you in really fine print white on black on these islands, a lot of different modes of data collaborations that have come up over the past 10 or so years. Starts with the open data islands on the very upper right part. So open data portals are maybe known to you, maybe the European Open Science Cloud. And then in the middle one, I would say there's the island where we will focus most. These are professional data intermediation situations of different source. There are more the island of Collaborador. They will be having a commercial arm, but maybe also a public arm. And then maybe on the side, you see the Isle of the Human, which is also something we will come to when we speak about My Data, PIMS, and other services. But really to say that there there's a lot of experimentation on data collaboration arrangements. There is by no means any stable model. There's certainly no stable terminology, so I will also try to do a bit of semantic translation here, because we discuss sometimes objects or models or business cases even that are not exactly the same, and that's also part of what makes our life so difficult. But also to say there's a lot of things going on, and it's really worth exploring the world of data collaborations, data partnerships, and that's maybe the essence of my talk today. Before really going into the intermediaries, a few key considerations of the EU data strategy, which is a document from February last year. It says basically, if we have to leverage on the potential of data, which is the potential that it can be copied at no cost, it's a non-rival resource, excludable, yes, but also with difficulties. We can really leverage on that value if we reuse existing data. Also, we don't have to create for every purpose data from scratch. We can find a lot of proxy data in this world, and the question is now, how can I have access to these proxy data? Do I have to always create the data myself or not? And reuse of data may often mean, or may sometimes mean, that you share across departments, across organizations, across companies. And when we say data sharing, we don't mean that it has to be for free. You know, probably there's a spectrum that also the UK Open Data Institute has been developed, but it's very popular, that there's different degrees of openness. I mean, general open data, as you find it on the most government open data portals, but then also club goods or restricted access, paying access, non-paying access. There's many modes of accessing data that we could call together data sharing. What the strategy really wants is that we share with reduced friction and transaction costs, but at the same time try to keep control. And also maybe here technology can be our friend to an extent, and we can maybe later discuss certain of the approaches taken. No approach fits every purpose, so we have to just keep all the breadth of the possibilities on our mind and see for which use case we can use what. Then obviously we want to make the emergence of collaborative ecosystems, which is something that is emerging. We will come to Gaia X and other things, so that we really also help stakeholders to put data together, because maybe no one alone may have enough data, other than maybe a really big company which has access to a lot of data from different sources. I mean, the so-called big tech platforms. Let's also name them. And that's really also what comes, I think, from the AI strategies, notably UK and France, that inspired, I think, myself most, to say we also need to work on data pooling. We need to, or as the French would call it, mutualisation, putting it together. And that's also what drives our work on intermediaries. And finally, I'm also maybe already making an advertisement here to the mydata.org movement, which is an association grown out of Finland, but is very global, which tries to push also the notion of equipping individuals with the tools to really become agents in the data economy. Don't always remain the passive data subject that has to be protected and doesn't know what he or she does. I think with the growing literacy in society, there's also a lot to do for agency of individuals in the data economy to become much more active. This is maybe the key background consideration. Now, how do we articulate this in terms also of legislation? How do the different pieces that you may have heard of fit together? We have maybe, well, 5 or 4 key instruments, and then an array of number 5s. The horizontal instruments maybe first. We will speak about the Data Governance Act. This is, I think, essentially about, when it comes to business situations, about fostering voluntary data sharing, data exchanges, data collaborations, lowering here the friction costs and the transaction costs, but helping also access to a specific subset of public sector information that has to be closed. And then we can maybe speak about that if you have questions on this. Normally, I wouldn't focus in this presentation on that. Stimulating also altruistic ways of handing over data for common good purposes. There's also a thinking on intermediaries there. I get back to that. And then the Data Act, maybe at the opposite end of the 4 first points, is more an instrument that would look at material rights to access and use data for specific parties where we believe the sector doesn't do so, or could be a regime also of fairness in B2B access, or fairness also vis-a-vis the government. Could the government also leverage on existing data resources, and if so, under which conditions? These are things we will look at under the Data Act. And then you certainly know the Digital Market Act, which is the platform regulation instrument for large online gatekeeper platforms that have really high threshold, and Andreas Hartl probably also gave you a bit of an expose of this, but just also maybe to hear from a commission source how we discuss the interplay of all these instruments. So the Digital Market Act obviously builds around the market power of large online platforms, and there are specific data portability obligations, but also certain restrictions on combination of data is foreseen in that draft. Both the Data Governance Act and the Digital Market Act are currently being discussed in the legislative process of the Union, so the European Parliament and the Council. On the Data Governance Act, I can maybe say we're quite close already to finalizing that discussion. The European Parliament has a position on this file. In the Council, we will probably see a position taking still this week, which means that then the two legislative parties can go to the compromise agreements, the so-called trilogue discussions that will maybe keep us busy until Christmas this year, maybe until January, we'll see. But that would bring us actually to a first conclusion of a new piece of legislation very, very shortly. So I'm also quite proud, because I was personally involved in this exercise, that we are after, I would say 2 years, which seems long, that the new commission is in place, December 2019 to December 2021, we have a complete piece of legislation that is already adopted. I think that's quite a marathon internally and externally. On the Digital Market Act, also under negotiations, also I think quite advancing well. If I know, it's not the thing I'm negotiating myself, so here I can only give you second-hand information. And the Data Act is only forthcoming, probably still before Christmas we will table the proposal. But actually this morning, while Andreas was speaking, I can give you a glimpse. I was typing a few provisions myself, had to think about a couple of things. And so we're drafting basically as we speak, and we were then obviously coordinating this a lot internally, so nothing really I can expose here, but we're heavily working on this Data Act. In between, the blue thing is an add-on to the Open Data Directive, which has decided that there should be a certain list, or like a certain provision of public sector data, which is of specifically high value, mapping information, weather information, statistical information, where there should be no problem to actually make this available to the entire digital economy at no cost and with machine readable interfaces, and maybe also in other standardization forms. This is also forthcoming. Colleagues are heavily working on this, and that should then also complement the picture on the open government data side. Now, on the very bottom, you see obviously there's also questions around specific settings, and most of you are familiar with the discussion around smart cars. First advertisement for the second track this afternoon at 4 o'clock. Carmen Schmidt from Volkswagen will probably talk about this, and encourage you to go maybe to that session as well. Knowing Carmen, there will be very interesting insights from that. Question is really now how we govern, what kind of data governance we do around the car. What are the different parties, the manufacturer, the user, leasing companies, road traffic authorities, what is in it, or aftermarket services, insurances, and so forth. There's lots of interesting stakeholders around in-vehicle data. Everyone would know what he or she would do with the data if she had access to it. And regulating this regime may be subject to a specific type approval legislation that might be updated next year. We could also see a mix between the Data Act and such in-vehicle data access regime, where the Data Act could actually be the overarching piece that tries to bring a certain consistency also in data access rights to a number of situations, not having cars being discussed next to tractors, smart metering, bank accounts, and maybe all the other objects that you are buying, and then platforms that run your voice assistant, so that we have also maybe a bit of a more harmonious regime when it comes to who can actually access and use what type of data in the digital and in the IoT economy. But that's still very much open, how far we will be able to distill some horizontal generic principles without being too bland. And what is really then left over for specific rules, because there's also questions of enforcement and design, obviously, of objects like cars and smart dishwashers and all these kind of things. Voila. So on the intermediaries, now this is maybe my focus of the remaining 10 minutes, if I may. I'm putting on the right-hand side a lot of logos of different organizations of different kinds. And as I said, there are so many terms on this map that I would maybe have my pick of the 7 key terms that I would like to at least quickly introduce here, and also say what I mean when I say data marketplace. Or data marketplace is a situation like an eBay, if you want, where you advertise, I have a certain data and I now like to find someone for data. It's a data insourcing problem, or for companies that would like to acquire, like they acquire other resources on the open market for a specific purpose, and where then a transaction happens and it's facilitated by a trader. On the right hand side, you see Snowflake and Darwex as maybe the examples for this type of segment. I'll come to the data trust because it's maybe more a novel thing, and I'll also deepen that a little bit, because that's also what is in Germany sometimes discussed, I think, as Datentreuhänder, suspecting that there's maybe a large German proportion in the audience. I'll discuss that notion a little bit more in detail. That's really, I think, an emerging notion on the data intermediary side. And it's also still maybe the one that is most complicated to actually design, and I'll give you a little tentative definition from my side as a basis for discussion later on. Then we have data ecosystem orchestrators. Now that sounds a bit fluffy, but I put a couple of names here on the slide. If I can maybe move this while I'm speaking, so I'm seeing my full screen. Okay, you see, obviously Gaia X. I mean, Gaia X is not the ecosystem orchestrator, but Gaia X will do the famous data spaces, and the famous data spaces need an orchestrator. In the German case, everyone knows Datenraum Mobilität, and there's the company Akatech, which is maybe semi-public even. So you say, well, okay, fine, that's the government setting up now this kind of mobility data space. But conceptually, especially in the Gaia X context, I understand that BMW may run the automotive or mobility data space. So a private company takes the lead, at least for conceptual development. And we shall later see who actually will run such a data space with all the rules that say, well, who can join and what type of standards are we using here, who's penalizing people if they don't behave. I mean, there's tons of roles to get a data space running. And even a smaller ecosystem, you see on the top right, BruCloud, which is the Brussels Cargo Airport cloud base for sharing information on freight that is incoming and outbound, so that lorries and airplane companies and customs always know where is this little parcel. And when can I actually come and pick it up, either to load it onto the plane or to load it into my lorry. So there's a lot of data sharing of this very mundane type happening here. But someone, a company called Nalian, runs this BruCloud and is basically the independent orchestrator of this little local, very targeted data sharing ecosystem. Then we have, this is, I also said, the personal data intermediaries. You see my data below as an umbrella brand. I think there's some 40 almost of startups of any scale that are active in the space. Many people may know Solid, which is the purplish S in the middle. Tim Berners-Lee's open source framework for data sharing services. Some of you may Cozy Cloud and DigiMe. This is basically the so-called PIMS, if you want, personal information management services. There's diff or personal data wallets, where it's about giving any of us as consumers in the data economy an option to also steer the use of the data about us and take active decisions, track the consent that we have given, withdraw maybe even the consent, exercise the right of data portability, tell maybe Spotify to allow my bank, if I'm daring enough, to actually know what I'm listening to, so they can do maybe funny new calculus on their credit rating models, if I'm daring enough to go for this route. Consumer protectionists in the room will already stream as I'm talking. But there may be actually also beneficial ways of using my existing personal data for something that would wrap around me. And I think especially in the smart car, you can easily see that. I mean, who is the car manufacturer, so to say, to decide above my head to whom I would want to give my repair and maintenance information in real time, so that ATU or someone else can come to me and say, I have a better offer you. And on the basis of anticipatory predictive maintenance. How am I actually organizing this? Maybe I need this personal data intermediary to do so, maybe also not. I mean, we can discuss that case as well. Data cooperatives is certainly something that we see emerging as a collective alternative to the personal data intermediaries, which are maybe more individual focused. So it's me and my data, whereas in the data cooperative, it's us and our data. And an easy example is a patient group of a specific disease condition that says, well, we'd like to collectively decide which pharma company should have our study data, because we know that our choices have also repercussions on each other. It's not that only my data choices impact on me, but they impact on people like me. And that, for that reason, we may actually form a cooperative. We also may form a cooperative if we're the delivery heroes of some town and say, well, I think we'll feel ripped off by this company, and we should now band together our data force and have alternative means of aggregation of data power in a cooperative and say, well, let's exercise this together. Or, I mean, in farming, in retail, many cooperatives models still exist in Germany and all over the world in terms of unionized or situations. Credit unions are very popular also in the US. So there is maybe also something to the idea of a data union or a data cooperative, if you want. And we can discuss that case certainly as well. Finally, with the Data Governance Act, we're creating a novel type, which is the so-called data altruism organization. And I'll also get back to that when we speak about the data trusts in a moment, because it's also a little bit complicated. And then finally, you have, especially mentioning International Data Spaces Association, iShare, also those who say we'll just go for reference architectures. We're not even facilitating from a business position the data sharing. We're just providing you guys with a standard, and that's pretty much, I think, what IDSA does in the Gaia X context, and brings a rule book, but rules in the technical as well as in the governance and the legal sense. And that's also a data intermediary function that is, I think, very, very helpful. Now, why are we looking so much at the intermediaries? I think I said it already a bit in the beginning. We want to professionalize certainly data sharing. So as we have done it with lending and handling money, we have invented financial institutions over the past 200 or many hundred years, but in the past 200 years, certainly a little more, that have different functions in the financial economy. And maybe for handling data, we also need some sort of intermediate functions. We shall see. I mean, it's maybe hard to say at this point in time, but the key would be that these data collaborations, which are still experimental, ad hoc, improvised, get a bit more stability and routine. And that's also pretty much what we want to achieve when we say we want to set up these data spaces, because the data spaces should really be the kind of setting where certain practices get standardized and therefore also less costly. And then there's also the trust element, because everyone abides by a certain standard, because there is an oversight mechanism that penalizes those who don't behave. We can also we also engage more in data collaborations, if you want. And the final thing next to trust is obviously a question who captures value. That's a really important thing also in the design of the data intermediation service, that we say, well, the value capture could maybe stay with the people who have the data or generated the data or who want to use the data, but should it always be with the intermediary? I mean, that's, I think, pretty much also a question in the platform discussion. I mean, who captures how much share of what value, and why is that a good idea, or maybe also not? So here also an open question from an economic point of view: which are the right aggregation points for capturing data value? The policy challenges in the Data Governance Act for us was that we looked at this intermediaries in its chapter 3 pretty much as an anticipation of the future, the platform of the future, so that if the data spaces really pick up, they could be the place to be for industry and really determine a lot of the economic stakes in digitized products and the related services. So the question being, should a data space actually be the next platform, and why, or why not? And we took a view that we should really be very careful, because people are quite wary of the platformizing effects of certain digitization trends, and so they only to a certain extent like what they see, and that guided us in the design of chapter 3, which is admittedly relatively strict on the economic limitations, and begs the question: is there incentives enough for people to become an intermediary? Maybe that question will also later come in the short question and answer thing. And then to align it well with data protection regulation, here just one word or one sentence: we tried to design it such that you can read the GDPR next to it, but indeed roles and concepts did not always fully map. And the question is whether an intermediary is a data controller or just a data processor will also depend very much on the exact business model of that company. Normally it could well be in the personal data intermediaries that the data intermediary is just a processor, because you as individual control the means, the ways and means of the processing operation, if you can. Now, some people scratch their head and say, how is that possible? I mean, I'm only the data subject. I'm not supposed to control anything. But that's an inbuilt, I think, antiquity of the data protection laws that conceptualize individuals only as passive subjects and never as the data controller. But maybe we will also see a bit of change of roles in terms of accepted data protection concepts, and say, well, maybe we individuals could also become a data controller, and maybe to in certain frameworks we actually could be. I'm tempted to jump this in the interest of time. Well, try to be brief. So the core element, what makes up to be a data intermediary, is that you have the main objective of matchmaking, of intermediation between demand and offer, with the ultimate outcome that you intend to create the legal and business relationship. We look at situations where businesses deal with business, but we also deal with the situations with the consumer at the center. So it's a B2C to B scenario. Consumer takes data from some service, gives it to another service. We've spoken about the individual versus collective scenarios, the data cooperatives, and we indeed regulate data intermediation as a service with a light notification regime that builds on ex post verification to keep the administrative burden at the setup phase, at least, relatively limited. We also differ from other jurisdictions like India. So we're not relying on the government to do this. We're relying on private enterprise to offer data intermediation services. While India is saying that was the outcome of the committee that was set up, no action taken so far. But also conceptually, the question also in Germany exists, shouldn't the public side offer a data intermediation service? We at the current thinking say at least private enterprise, but it shouldn't exclude that also the public sector becomes active and offers an intermediation service. Now, maybe the last subject is the question what to do now with the data trust and the Datentreuhänder. And you see my tentative definition on the first bullet, which already means that there is a degree of autonomy and independence in the Treuhänder, who has to be able to be a bit autonomous and not just an implementing tool of the side that gives you the data, be it the data subject or a company. We have, I would say, to a certain extent, we have a public data intermediaries with Forschungsdatenzentren, with the FinData in Finland, Health Data Hub in France, where the law, the legislature defines that certain data assets from public sources can be used for certain things, and that these entities that I put here on the screen have a capacity to actually then decide on the basis of each use case. So it's already, I think, a kind of a Datentreuhänder situation or a data trust situation, but a public one. Complicating factor, rights under the GDPR are not transferable, but also question whether there should be delegation of rights to data trustees. That's pretty much a discussion of the My Data approach. But please also see that in France, at least, the Data Protection Authority, CNIL, is, I think, a bit more open to this and has provided guidelines on how you can actually mandate someone to exercise certain rights under GDPR, namely the right to data access and portability. Broad consent has a certain potential, I think, in science, but then the question is also, if I now were a retail chain or a bunch of retail chains, I want to make my loyalty card data better usable for anything, could I just collect on a broad and unspecific consent the data, and where are the limits? I probably couldn't use the broad consent as in recital 33 of the GDPR, but I could probably try to be a bit vague in the purposes. And that's, I think, the constant challenge here. And that's certainly something where data protection colleagues are very watchful and say, no, specified is the consent, but yeah, what's specified? In the context of the data cooperatives, I spoke about them. It's just one example where you basically, there's a license behind this link that you can check out where people then donate their license for an altruistic purpose. And then the question is, to what extent can a data trust also provide anonymization as a service, or organize the deployment of machine learning algorithms that go back to the source, to individuals, to companies, and be an organizer of this. Then the last word maybe, because it's so complicated, because not every country has set up in law that certain public data intermediaries should exist, and that certain derogations from the GDPR may be permissible. We rely very much in the Data Governance Act on the notion of consent. So it's in altruistic situations, Datenspende, or in the economic situations, it's a consent-based system, which obviously has also certain limitations. That was a quick run, and almost half an hour gone. I hope we still have time for questions.
Thank you so much, Malte. I think you, during your presentation, you answered the two questions that were posed earlier today to Andreas Hattel, because they were mainly about what kinds of data intermediation services we can envisage basically. And I really liked your conceptual clarifications on that one. So I think we answered that one, but I have one question in the chat here, which I'd like to give over to you. Given the strict regulation imposed on data intermediaries by the Data Governance Act, do you think running data marketplaces can still be commercially viable? Because existing marketplaces seem to be very small as it is.
Well, I mean, maybe get into business with the company from Europe that we know best, called Dawex, who confirms to us, yes, you can. Yes, you can. And Snowflake and Amazon Web Services are maybe the biggest competitors. Yes, you can. It's maybe not in the public eye because it's a behind the scenes sourcing situation. That's for the pure marketplaces. And we see emergence of ecosystems also in agriculture. I think there's a clear need for this. And I think people are willing to pay for this. I should have advertised also Deutsche Telekom, Data Intelligence Hub. These are still emerging and it may take time, but I think with the data spaces, we also clearly see the need not only for a marketplace, but for an ecosystem orchestrator. So I think all these roles are truly necessary. And I think I see Alexander Sieverts from It's My Data is coming next. He will probably also answer that question, how we will make the thing run. Now, on Acatech, I take the point. I mean, if it's as long as you fund publicly the data space, it's not very convincing because then you say, well, this is a public thing. But I can see, as I see it in the BrüCloud situation, that Nalian, the company behind it, runs it. It works. It's just maybe not so present in the public eye quite yet.
Okay, but it's still possible, even though we do see some restrictions and some regulation in the Data Governance Act right now. I think we're all very much looking forward to the publication of the Data Act. As you know, we took part in the consultation process as well. And as Data Act and Data Governance Act are so closely interlinked, yeah, we are very much looking forward to what the Data Act might look like. So I guess we all yeah, we wish you luck in yeah, in holding the timeline, because you said you might be able to publish the proposal by the end of this year, and yeah, it's already the end of September, so it's October, November, yeah, a little less than 3 months you have left. Fingers crossed, Malte, because yeah, I think we're all waiting for the proposal. And thank you so much for your great presentation today, because we already discussed this morning. There are so many regulations out there, so many proposals, that it's sometimes hard to yeah, understand all of it and how it's all connected. And yeah, you made it easier. Absolutely. So thank you so much for your time, and I hope to see you soon.
But we're facing, last word maybe on the Data Act, we're also facing criticism. We're loading too much into one instrument, which at least is internally coordinated. So when you write an instrument, you coordinate inside, but then we have this proliferation that you rightly note. if we were to coordinate all this into one instrument, we would not finish the work. It would be like the German Zivilgesetzbuch BGB from the 1900s, which took 30 years to develop. So it's also that's I think the downside of doing things in digital, that you have to be fast and maybe a bit piecemeal. But thank you, Rebecca, and I will stay in the session for a little moment.
Cool.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. See you soon.